dance, the time to learn new skills, to paint and draw and garden and go and see friends I haven't seen for years. The ones I spent my youth with, growing up and dancing with.
Love me or hate me, I'm still going to rock. So welcome, dear listeners, to a fresh new show of Women of Our Time, where I, Rosie Wall, will share with you the extraordinary lives of women, both in our local and wider communities. So, without further ado, let's go! Well, welcome Dee Wild Kearney, novelist, artist, WASPI woman activist, mother, grandmother and philanthropist. Gosh, that's a list. Yes! Oh, what an absolute honour and pleasure it is to have you in our studio today for Women of Our Time, Dee. I'm so excited for the listeners because you, for me, combine the very best of what it is to be a woman. Womankind.
W-O-M-A-N.
Yes! Yes! You are a warrior of a woman who is an activist in the WASPI Justice for Pensions rights movement, and you are going to talk in detail about that today.
Can I just interject in there, because obviously we say the term WASPI, but I do want to make it clear that I go across lots of different campaign groups, but they tend to know us as the WASPI women, but there are many, many campaign groups, but we will refer to us as WASPI because it's so much easier.
Yeah. I will lay that out for the listeners in a little while as well. It is a Justice for Pensions rights movement, and you're going to tell us a lot about the work that you've done for them later on in this episode.
Yeah.
But that aside, that amazing stuff aside, you are also a creative artist, and you are launching your book, which was released this year, and you're also a practising painter.
Oh, some would say master of all trades, isn't it? Or a jack of all trades, isn't it? Master of none.
Love it, love it, love it. And as if that wasn't enough, you're also a mother.
I am, very importantly.
And, of course, a grandmother.
Even more importantly.
And a local volunteer, we love you, and a philanthropist.
Yes, yes, I do like that word.
It's gorgeous, isn't it?
I'm going to practice that word.
I like it. I'll get you a T-shirt with it on. Well, welcome, wonderful Dee. So today you're going to give us an overview of your personal life. And as ever on Women of Our Time, we're fascinated by turning points, and including the stuff that's heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. I want listeners to hear a recording that you did, a pre-record for Women of Our Time, about your early life, because we're going to go right back to the start. Mm-hmm. So this is about your early life in Rochdale, Lancashire, and just listening to it, listeners, you're going to be swept away. Dee's voice is so magical and dreamy, and she's just, she's got it. So, Dee, can I just ask you to do a little introduction to that pre-record on your earlier life?
Yeah, I'll try not to drop too much into my Lancashire accent. I was asked, obviously, to talk about my earlier life and what the influences are. And I do believe quite strongly that we are, as children, influenced by our surroundings, by our upbringing, by our experiences. And I had two very strong females in my life. One was my grandmother, May, who, Children of May, the book is based on.
Oh, that's what the book's called.
Yeah. Children of May.
Right.
Yeah. And I consider myself a child of May. And also my nana, who was a singer on the music halls and the stages and the clubs and pubs, and she was very glamorous. She was the opposite to my grandmother. My grandma was very intelligent and very feisty, and my nana was very glamorous and loved creativity. So I think I've got an equal dose of
both measures.
Both measures of creativity and feistiness from them.
Well, look, let's listen to this wonderful clip. So, listeners, pull that radio close and listen up.
I was born just outside of Rochdale in a little village, in Rochdale Infirmary, but in a little village just outside called Shaw. I say sure because we moved around quite a lot, so we had several houses in that area. And one of the main influences for me were my grandparents. My grandmother May, as you will know from my book, was a very strong character and she's very protective, and I always had a lot of time with my grandmother. And one of the main moments, though, was with my grandfather when I was very, very young, because he died when I was very young. And one of my main memories is actually of him sitting me on his knee on his horse and cart, because he was a rag and bone man at the time, and letting me think, because I was holding the reins of the horse, that I was actually driving the horse and car up Huddersfield Road onto the moors with him, and it stuck with me even as a small child. My other main influence was my nana. It was my father's mother, and they were, you know, my grandmother was quite a poor background. They were very poor, whereas my nana had come from quite a wealthy family, and my father was quite well-to-do in his ways, but a lovely natural man. He was a lovely, lovely man. And she was a singer, and she should have opened the inaugural programme of the BBC, but she was too frightened to go on board and sing live on the day. So somebody else got to be the person who was famous. Forgotten her name right now, but she actually could have been the person who launched the first BBC programme with a vocal rendition of something of the time. Anyway, my nana, I used to go and watch her occasionally on stage, and I always remember her looking very, very glamorous. She used to sing in the old clubs and music halls. Her name was Ivy Barry, and she literally used to stand up there. She had a beautiful blue lurex evening dress and gorgeous sparkly jewellery, which was all costume obviously at the time, but she just looked so glamorous. And she took me up on stage once as a tot and let me come on and introduce me to the audience, and they all applauded. And I was captivated. I was absolutely captivated by the lights and the sort of the faces that were slightly lit up in the audience, and the smell of hemp. And I don't mean the vegetable kind, I'm talking of the rope kind, and the smell from the lights and the wood of the theatre. And, even though it took me till I was 30 to go back into theatre and start there, I always think that those early memories stayed with me, and that is what made me crave being part of the theatre. So those were my early influences. Another influence for me in later life was because we always moved around. I think I moved around about 17 times. We went to around the Manchester area, we went to Blackpool, we went to Birmingham, and then we moved back to Manchester. So, I'd just make friends, and those friends then I was whisked off somewhere else. So in later life, my friends have been extremely important to me, that I keep them and I keep the contact with them, and and make more, obviously, which we do, but those early friends that I have had from when I finally settled down have stayed with me on the whole, and they're still my very dearest friends to this day.
So listening back to that, Dee, clearly that matriarchal pattern in your family with your early influences, you had strong female role models.
Oh, absolutely.
So you knew actually what it was to be a strong woman and to face challenges. Tell us anything else about your childhood that you want the listeners to know.
Well, as I say, I did have, I had a lovely family around me, but unfortunately my mother and father got divorced. And
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I didn't have the best of happy childhoods from the age of about 10, because I had a stepfather I didn't particularly like, and we won't go into that. But as I say, one of the things that happened, we were moved around quite a lot. So I think by the time I'd reached 17, I'd moved really about 17 times.
Oh, that's awful, yeah.
And one thing that does for you, it makes you value friends in later life. And so I was never able to keep and form friends, and I was an only child. So I learnt to entertain myself. I'd draw, I'd play, I'd make up plays, I'd dress up and make costumes. It was all coming in at an early age, So I had a great imagination, and I used it quite a lot as a child to entertain myself, because I was on my own quite a lot. When I did escape, and we did find friends, you could find me in wellies, wading through dikes as a real tomboy. and we had a great time, you know. But then we were moved on again, and I did actually manage to, as I said in my earlier clip, I think, stay in my secondary school the whole length of time from arriving there till leaving. So, and it really made me value friends. So now in later life, when I have friends, I keep them unless it's absolutely impossible, because I do believe that, you know, you can choose your friends, as they say. It's quite a common cliche, but you can choose your friends, and I have some fantastic friends who've been with me for over 30 years.
Why don't you give a shout out to some of your friends?
Right, and
like to...
Okay, do you want the list?
Yeah. I know, do you know what? You're going to forget a few, because there's probably
I'm going
quite
to say,
a lot.
all of you that I forget, I am so sorry. Don't beat me up for it afterwards. First of all, one of my best friends in all the world, Christina and John.
Hello, Christina.
In Manchester.
Hello, John. Hi.
Who are like my brother and sister. And I have my other sister, Lynn. And then I have my best mate, the mad woman from Wales, and she won't mind me saying that, who's my best bud and sister, and that's Carol.
Hello, Carol.
And
hi.
she's unfortunately in lockdown in Wales at the moment, but I did manage to get to see her briefly when they let them free for a little while.
Yes.
Yeah. And as I say, I've got many, many friends. My art friends, I've got Sue, I've got Kim, I've got Andy, I've got Chris, I have got my best bro in all the world, which is Colin, who's actually Hilton. His actual name is Hilton Collins, but he's my mate Colin.
Hello, Hilton Collins.
Many, many more that I've probably forgotten so many here.
Well, look, just on the back of all that, we're going to move towards your first inspirational song, so you can certainly dedicate this song to your dear friends, but also it represents a period of your life growing up where you were just wild with the happiness of life.
Everything was so exciting.
So you've chosen David Bowie,
yes,
and the world and I, of course, thank you for this choice, because we bow at his altar as ever. What a legend and a genius man.
Absolutely.
Tell the listeners what track you chose and why, Dee.
Well, I heard this. I had heard Bowie tracks before, and I'd already started to get into David Bowie, but I was your typical teenager. I used to chase all these awful boy bands.
I thought you were going to say just boys generally.
Generally.
I can hear you on that
I
one.
moved from a grammar school in Birmingham to a secondary modern, as I say, and there was boys there, so the world was my lobster at that time.
Yes.
And basically I had got into Bowie, and I thought, this is really good. He's really strange, this guy. But this particular track I heard when I was about 14, and it was just this combination of weird, powerful, and it was almost this epic sound, and I was just hooked. There's certain storytelling geniuses out there that I am major fans of to this day, Springsteen being one, Joni Mitchell,
yes,
and Stevie Nicks are just magical, you know, presences when they perform, to mention just a few. But for some reason, they're great storytellers, but when Bowie played a song, it was almost visual. It wasn't just a story. It created a visual feeling. That's all I can describe it.
That's a really good analogy.
Yeah, and I just lost myself in it, in the strain. And I also, you know, the day he died, I remember my friend Chris and I and others. Suddenly Chris put a line up from one of his songs, and then I put another line up from one of his songs, because each of his songs was so unique, and they were like, one line was a poem. It was just a poem in itself.
That day was a cathedral worship to the man.
It was, yeah.
I still don't know how we're going to manage to live without it.
And I never tire of him. And that track that blew me away, that was so epic, was Life on Mars.
It's a god-awful small affair to the girl with the mousy hair, but her mommy is yelling no. With the clearest view, then she's hooked to the silver screen. The grown up a cow. Now the workers are struck for fame, 'cause Lennon's on sale again. See the mice in their million hordes, from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Rule Britannia is out of bounds, to my mother, my dog and clowns. But the film is a sad thing more, 'cause I wrote it 10 times or more. It's about to be written again, as I ask you to focus on the things I can hear the dance floor. Oh man, look at those came and go. It's a freakiest show. Take a look at the oh man, reading up their own guide. Oh man, wonder if you'll ever know. Is that the best-selling show? It's alive on
Wow, listening to that is like, well, it's like sustenance, isn't it?
Gives me bumps all the time.
How can we live without him? I don't understand. What a total legend, and what a brilliant choice. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Dee. He evokes that period of your life so powerfully for you, and that was leading to and always going to be about you returning to the theatre. So talk to us about your theatre world. What have you enjoyed about your design and production management? What fascinates you about that?
Well, I think the first thing that fascinates me about being in theatre and being able to be in production management or design or costume or set design is the fact that you have this almost carte blanche to create your own little world and live in it.
Yes.
And leading up to that, you have all the fun and the camaraderie of working with your teams and being as silly as you like, and then when it all comes together, you have presented the public with this piece of art and performance that hopefully, you know, will give them a lasting memory. I was never happier when I was covered from head to foot in paint. And one friend of mine once said that my Doc Martens one day would end up with the Turner Prize if we put it in a glass case. They've got so many different colours of paint on. They're a piece of art in themselves, you know.
Well, look, you very kindly also did a pre-record for us about your feelings on theatre. So
Yeah.
let's listen to that.
Okay. I did actually go and retrain when the kids were a little older, and I went into a stage management and design course at my local college, which at that time was in Oldham. I came out with a student prize and was employed immediately to do some freelance work, and I kind of never looked back from there, you know, and I couldn't go far afield because I had 2 children. I was a single parent, and it was always a struggle, but I have to say that life was never boring because I was working in the theatre. Every day was a different magical thing you could create, you know, and you watch the shows, you watch the rehearsals. So I became very, very popular in that local area for being a reliable and an inventive designer, and that's what I did. I then started to cross over into film and television, and that's what I started to work towards. Unfortunately then my mother got dementia, so again, 1950s girl, you know, you put everything of your own aside because it's ingrained into you that you need to look after your family. And it was a very difficult time because then I had to sort of just as I was on the rise in my career, I had to downscale it again in order to look after my mother, who actually suffered with it terribly. You know, some people are happy in dementia. My mother unfortunately wasn't, and she could get quite aggressive, which was not like a normal personality. And it was a difficult 14 years for us with my mum. But the rest of my time I loved because, you know, life was always interesting. I then started, as part of my design capabilities, to look at, you know, just my normal artwork. I bumped into a quite well-known painter who was just a character, to say the least, and during the course of my work. And David Vaughan, he's actually he was Sadie Frost's dad, and I became close friends, and I'm still very good friends with his wife and his widow to this day. But David actually said to me, you know, don't you know you're an artist? Come and paint with me. And he mentored me, and he got me going. Now, once someone takes you into art, you know, you come away from the design side of things, and I sort of weaned myself away from the theatre in order to pursue my art. And we all know that, you know, artists never make much money, and that's the case, but I loved what I did. And I think that's where I'm going to go. Now, for that time, I had so many songs, but I'm going to go back to the one that reminds me of all the fun I had with my college buddies, some of whom remain my friends to this day, even though we're far afield. But I'm going to say Two Princes. And that was the song, because it just symbolised the fun we had in those early years when we were training in stage management and design at college.
that was Two Princes by the Spin Doctors. Wow. Those were your theatre years, Dee, so we love the sound of that phase of your life.
Yeah, it was so exciting. It was so much fun. You know, we'd hang out in the Spotted Cow. I was 30, but I was having my second teenage that I never got when I was younger.
Yes.
And we'd drink loony juice, and I think we once went on...
What's loony juice?
I have no idea, but all I can say at the end of it, we had a 13-hour event drinking spree on the town and drunk ourselves sober, and I'm not a drinker, so you can imagine the state I was in. But stay off the loony juice, folks.
I like that. But right, look, we've come to an absolutely critical moment of your life, but also this episode. Dee, you're going to talk to us about the extraordinary work that you do for the 1950s women, also known as WASPI women, and their fight for justice, for lost pensions from the 1950s. So please could you give the listeners a backstory and an update on all your involvement with this, the 1950s women's pensions injustice movement.
Yeah, I think the only way I can do it is to briefly as possible tell you what happened to me. Obviously, I was very lucky because I had a husband who was working. You know, I had some savings. We downsized our house in readiness to maybe move to France and take a life change there and take things a little easier. And that was our ambition, really. And we started working towards that when we found out, obviously, that Sarah and Jay were pregnant. And then we obviously had all the trauma, which we'll talk about, you know, in the next episode. But we then had a decision to make, was whether we came down to Kent to help them, because at that time they'd no care. They'd no care and no helpers. And Ishana required 24-hour care. So we made a decision that we thought we were going to have to go, you know, and Dunga says, I think we're going to have to go down and help them. And I said, yeah, I think we must really. So we had some savings set away to sort of lead up to our pension and to help us in our pension years. And we thought, well, we can use those for the next 4 or 5 years till I hit pension age, and then I'll have my pension. So we came down.
So what age had you expected that to be?
60.
60. Yeah.
60.
Right.
Always had.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Never been told any different.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And I think what younger people don't understand, that when we were younger, you either heard it on the radio, you saw it on the TV, or you saw it in the newspapers, and that was it. That was the major community, or somebody wrote you a letter, okay?
Yes.
And that was the only way you found out news in those days. I mean, you know, it's inconceivable now because everything we can do, we can virtually tell the world within 3 minutes of what we're doing, but on social media nowadays. But that wasn't the case back then. So that, you know, bear that in mind when I'm telling this story, because you've got to look at it from that perspective. And so I came down here with Duncan and myself, and we set up home. And when I reached 59, I found out from a chance post from a friend on Facebook that not only was I not going to get my pension at 60, but I was going to have to wait a further 6 years.
Yeah, 66 is retirement.
66 years. And that's what happened to me, okay? In monetary terms, it is something around about £54,000.
That's extraordinary.
That has been taken from me. Yeah. And that is phenomenal it any... Is. And bearing in mind, I've got a husband and I have some savings. Can you imagine if you're widowed or divorced or on a very low wage and you've never been able to earn much in your life?
Or just single, like me.
Or just single.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and that was thrown at us. So I think what I'd like to do is, because what we see or hear is generally through the spin that the government puts on it, and what the media occasionally sees on the odd bit, we never get to hear the truth. And so therefore, many people don't understand what has actually happened to these women, and there is 3.8 million of them.
So there are 3.8 million women out there,
mothers and grandmothers,
who are owed 6 years of their pension.
Some are owed 2 or 3, some are owed 3 or 4.
Oh, that's right.
Majority, 2.6 million of them, will have to wait 6 years.
That is
it's outrageous.
It's an extraordinary amount of money.
Tell me anyone that's had more than a couple of years hike, apart from the 1950s women, and we've had treble treble the height that anybody else has probably had, you know. So the best way I can explain it is to actually do it on a on a chronological timescale, because that's how it puts it simply.
Yes.
And I do apologise if I do go on with this, but I have to get through the time
This
scale.
is it.
Yep.
This is, you know, your moment.
Yeah. 1995, they brought in the Pensions Act, which was going to take women's pensions to the same as men of 65 years old. And obviously that was done to equalise pensions, which in the name of equality, I have no problem with that at all, and I doubt many women had.
Right.
Had they told us, which we weren't told.
Now that's the point.
Now there's the difference.
Right.
Okay. It was going to be over a greater number of years so that people would have time to prepare. But in 2011, they dramatically accelerated this to they were trying to go even higher, but there was a bit of a hoo-ha, and then they backpedaled a little bit. But they did say then it was going to be 66, and they pushed that acceleration through Parliament. Again, very little notice, but, you know, if we had been told, which we weren't.
So there could be no opposition because no one was told.
And if you want to take it to court, you know, there are timescales on this, so just bear that in mind, okay?
Right.
So it stands to reason that a government that's trying to sneak in a great little cash grab from these vulnerable women who have never really been used to arguing with anybody, you know, and
we're going to talk about the 1950s women and expectations laid on women.
Yeah, and you know, these women had been brought up to think that the best they could do, if they were lucky, was get a bit of a job as a secretary.
Yes.
You know, they couldn't even get their own mortgages. They had to get someone to sign for them. They very rarely, just a few of them, managed later on to get private pensions. I didn't get my first private pension probably till about 2007. Something like that.
Yes.
So, you know, a lot of these women were housewives, they were mothers, that's all they'd ever been. And then as work life got harder, people started to do part-time jobs, and women then started to try and look for careers probably later in life.
Right. There was an attempt at participation in what was otherwise just a male domain.
You know, dominated society. And, you know, that's widely recognised.
Yes.
And to this day, we are still talking today, every day at some point, about the gender pay gap, the gender pensions gap, and obviously there are still inequalities in the workplace. We, you know, anyone reasonable will admit that that's still going on. So we still haven't got true equality. But those women had suffered sexism, you know, they'd been their expectations in life,
just a lack of opportunity.
Yeah, they were minimal, you know. I was probably a little bit stranger because obviously I got married early, got divorced, and then started thinking, I've got to earn a living here, I better get retrained.
Right.
And that's what happened to me.
Yeah.
So anyway, just going back to chronological. So the government then at that point, in 1997, when they have been asked what they did to inform us, told us that in 1997 they sent out 47,000 leaflets to for 3.8 million women. So if you do the sums, and I'm not great going backwards, especially when I'm on microphone, but, you know, do the sums, 3.8 million women, 47,000 leaflets. So the priority of those leaflets, would you believe, was sent to financial advisors so that they could advise the wealthier pensioners that they needed to make provision. Us poor souls who had very little didn't give a hoot about us. They were also said they were sent to the job centre. We've got job centre managers who have since worked in Whitehall that were prepared to stand up in court and say this was not happening. We never saw those leaflets. So the leaflets were supposedly sent to the job centres. You had to ask for them. So there weren't... you had to ask.
These women...
Yeah, that were housewives.
Had every right to claim their pensions when they should have.
Yeah.
Would only have access to the change of this legislation if they asked
a job centre advisor, presuming they ever got to go in a job centre, But then again, to ask for a leaflet you have actually got
to know about it in the first place.
In the first place, exactly.
Oh, no.
There's my point. Okay, they did do a small article in the back pages of the Financial Times, you know.
Did they?
And of course,
Right.
being a housewife and you know, running 2 and 3 jobs to keep a roof over my head after my divorce, I'm sure I was running out every day to buy the Financial Times and read it from cover to cover. So basically,
historically, what
you know, and
was laid out.
eventually at some point they did the Talking Dogs advert, but that was for everybody's pensions. It didn't even mention the 1950s women. So I would ask you then, they all know where we live because we pay tax.
Right.
Once a year they send us a P60.
Yes.
So why did they not have a big square box highlighted on those P60s saying this legislation has come into play? If you were born between this and this date, you must expect that your state pension age is going to rise by this much. You must make provision now. Everybody would have held up their hands and said, we should have known it was on the P60.
Yes, yes,
okay?
yes.
I have asked them to prove that they told me, and they can't do that. I've freedom of information. They cannot do that.
Was there not a court case that you attended?
Well,
you're
going
to
back
lead
to this, Anna,
right,
you've
sorry.
led me. You've led me right into it. So obviously, you would know there are various campaign groups, of which Back to 60 is one, and Back to 60 undertook crowdfunding from all the 1950s women.
Wow!
And they all clubbed to. Some of them put in 50p, some of them put in £500. You know, they did what they could, and they got the fees together to take it to court.
Spectacular!
And in the court, Back to 60 presented evidence, and there was 6 secret Whitehall memos that not only demonstrated that the women, up to 50% of the women didn't know, but that they deliberately chose not to inform the women even when they knew that they didn't know. Okay, so Peter Lilly in 1997 was informed by a memo that they expected 50% of these women had no idea what was going to hit them when they thought they were at pension age, and he actually declined to spend any more money to inform the women that this was going to happen to them. Okay, Amber Rudd. We all know Amber Rudd.
Yes.
As Pensions Minister, says many times said that she kept on trying to alleviate the unfairness of these short notice changes, and she was instructed by Ian Duncan Smith, who was Secretary for State.
Yes.
And the ladies love Ian Duncan Smith. Not. Yeah. And he instructed her not to engage with the 1950s women, and in short he said, ignore them, they will go away. Now,
what a
why would he say
spectacular
that?
quote,
Yeah. Ignore them, will go away. It's become our watchword now. We're everything not going away. Yeah, it's our watchword everywhere.
Yes.
But he knew that by going back to court timescales, he knew that by delaying the information getting out there, those women would be too old, too worn down. They would be out of time in the courts to challenge it, or he thought they might be, and they would, some of these women would have probably died before they could come together and mount a campaign.
So it's just a question of buying time.
He was buying time so that we wouldn't be informed, so that we couldn't mount a challenge to this policy.
Right.
2007, Labour was in. This is a real good memo they found, and the memo actually states that a direct mail to this group of women was the most appropriate way of minimising, the word minimising, future criticism that the department had not been sufficiently proactive in communicating to those women affected by the changes. Minimising means they knew it was big, they knew there was going to be a lot of criticism, and they were trying to negate it and minimise that criticism by sending out letters. They didn't actually get round to sending some letters till 2009, which was, for the oldest of that cohort of women, was a year before their pension was due when they found out.
So this all started in 1995.
Yeah, 14 years later.
14 years later.
They sent the first letters.
Right, fascinating,
isn't it? Isn't it just? And my age group, 1956 to 58, to 60, didn't get letters up until, I think mine was due on the grid when I checked it, October 2013. I, like thousands of women, did not get a letter. I've challenged them to prove it. They can't. yeah? And Steve Webb, who was Pensions Minister at the time that the letters were sent, he actually was giving evidence to the Work and Pensions Committee in 2016, and his words were that obviously it had been, the mail-outs had been problematical, and in his opinion, if any woman had come to him and said she'd not received a letter, then he would be inclined to believe her. And that was from the horse's mouth. You know, so all of these things were stacking up that we know it's a great injustice. The problem that Back to 60 had was the fact that when they got to court, the government, I forgot what they call him, but he's like the Wolf of Wall Street, you know, he's a legal representative for the DWP. And basically they cited that primary legislation and secondary legislation has no obligation of fairness, and you have no obligation to be told about the legislation they're bringing in that will affect you. And that was the only thing, despite all the overwhelming evidence that it was clear that a grave injustice had been carried out.
Yes.
The judges had to go on a point, because it was legislation, they could not oppose the law on legislation. So whilst the judges were sympathetic, we lost. And again, it's gone recently back to appeal. And that same old, you know,
caveat,
has come out again. And we are now...
It's built into its very infrastructure. I wonder if that would be similar if it was men from then their pensionable age, or is it the fact that it is really taking advantage of that group of
women that never had
vulnerable women.
We were vulnerable because we were never. I was never. I'm a feminist now, but in when I was in my 20s,
there are feminist men out there.
Absolutely.
You know, all hail to them.
Yeah.
But we are talking specifically.
About women who really, in those days, their expectations weren't high, and feminism wasn't really on the up.
No.
Until I was about 30, and I started to sort of, you know, and I'm not a raving feminist. I believe we should have equal rights on all sides.
Equality, that's
and that's where I stand on that. So,
can I just ask you one thing about the court case? Because I remember we had a discussion around that time, and you said that the media coverage on, I asked you, how did it go? What was it made? And quite astonishingly, you said to me that you stood there for hours at a time with your banners, and you made all these banners weeks ahead of time and laid them all out. You'd all travelled up there. Yeah. You'd spent the whole day doing this, and the media specifically started filming a different section of the Parliament area that you were in.
We were up there. This time we're talking that you and I were talking about was during Brexit, the lead up to Brexit.
Right.
There was about a dozen Brexiteers.
Yes, a dozen. Yeah. At that point.
Opposing, outside Parliament. The 1950s women were on the Green. They stormed the Green under the press banners. And what we noticed was that the cameramen were coming behind us. And it was only because we'd got this thing of purple umbrellas that anyone actually cottoned on to what had happened, because all the WASPI women write the names of their dead sisters and any slogans on the purple umbrellas. And that's our slogan, like the Lilac Mary Poppins.
Yes, brilliant.
And we noticed that on the 6 o'clock news, they were passing the back of us off as Brexit protesters. And not a mention of the fact that we were far outnumbered them. I mean, we've a couple of times brought the traffic to a standstill in Westminster Square outside Parliament, and we've done a sit-in in the DWP. We didn't get one iota. I had to go live on Facebook to get any coverage out there, because not one TV programme covered that we'd actually gone into the DWP in London and had a sit-in for 3 hours, and we were threatened with arrest and all sorts. I mean, you know, I haven't been arrested yet. I'm sure I will be at some stage. Oh dear. But and we find that the press picks and chooses what it wants to show, and
I just feel so sad about that one point, because so much of this is about the PR that you can generate and the light that you can shine on these important issues. Yeah. And that one moment was just wiped out.
Yeah. The only time we actually got great coverage was when the women went in on budget day, and they brought the budget to a standstill and got a standing ovation from the other side of the House to the Conservatives when they all stood up in the middle of the budget and interrupted the budget and held up the amounts of money that had been taken from them.
How opportune
and they got
that
a standing
is.
ovation from the majority of the Commons.
Gosh, that's amazing.
That made the news, obviously, because we couldn't really avoid that because it's been broadcast live, you know.
Anyway, sorry, I interrupted your chronology.
No. I'm done anyway. But another thing, recently, you know, there is lots of debates about us in Parliament. So ask yourself, why is there lots of debates about us in Parliament? And I'll tell you why. Because everybody knows that this has been a major injustice. And MP after MP after MP is standing up again and again and again. And
justice... That's an interesting word, isn't it?
Well, one MP, who was an ex-chief inspector in his inaugural speech, actually mentioned us in his opening speech, his first speech in Parliament, as being the biggest crime of this century committed against the 1950s women.
An extraordinary man.
An ex-police inspector.
That's an extraordinary man, standing up for the women.
Yeah. And we've got some great politicians, men and women, that back us to the hilt.
Yes, and that's what we need more of, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We need people for fighting for this sense of what is right.
Yeah.
And we need the sense of justice.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what is this thing called democracy?
Well, just going to recently in this food meals, these free school meals.
Yes, very topical.
Debacle.
Yes.
Yeah. We know what's happening. You know, the Conservatives have a majority, therefore the whip tells them the way they're voting, and they vote that way because they're feathering their own nest on the majority of the terms, and they're very careful not to upset the party whip. I would far greater respect them if they stood up for some principles instead of just following the crowd, you know. And a lot of there are some Conservatives basically have come down and stood up on their principles on our behalf, but obviously the majority of the opposition to what's happened to us is coming from Labour, SNP, Independents, and a few Conservatives who've basically got the grit to stand up and say it how it is, you know.
So, Dee, what are the next steps? What can be done now?
Well, this is a problem. If I can just go just back to, we need to engage people like Unison. Yeah, we need the unions behind us, because women have paid into unions all their life.
That's true.
And Dave Prentice is the General Secretary of Unison recently. He stated the decision to hike, and he said the word hike, the state pension age with no notice, didn't just throw the retirement plans in the air, it also left many women with lower income struggling to make ends meet. I'm going to go one further, and I can evidence this. It has caused suicide. It has caused malnutrition and starvation. It has caused illness and death through stress. It has caused people who are too ill. I'm talking men and women here. It's happening to men now as well.
Yes,
so this isn't a woman thing. This is for all of us. But particularly for us, because we've been hit hardest. But it's causing people who are too ill to work beyond 60 to be forced out there because they've no other alternative to keep food on their table and a roof over their heads than to carry on working. One, in a high-risk COVID environment where the World Health Organization says they're vulnerable, but our government doesn't.
Magnified all the more now, isn't it?
Yeah, and they are working them to death. They're disabling them because they are not physically able to do the work that they're having to do if at 60 plus they can get a job at all. So this is women who have made, they've taken early redundancy thinking they were heading to retirement in a couple of years and then found themselves with nothing.
Yes.
So this is where we're at. So we need the unions. This rapid decline is caused by ourselves because we put people in power who we should not allow to be in power because they have no regard for life or morality or just general justice. And I think, quite frankly, if we vote with our purse rather than our conscience, then we deserve the world we get.
Well, this leads perfectly to your final song choice here, which is about power. You have chosen for us your final song today.
This is one of the most moving songs that, as far as I'm concerned, I think it was calling out Bush at the time, but it applies to any Prime Minister, President who has no conscience. One quote for me that I saw in only the last few days, and it really resonated, and this, you know, as far as I'm concerned, it sums up this song as well. And that quote is that poverty exists not because we can't afford to feed the poor, but we can't satisfy the rich. And I just think that song just sums that up perfectly.
La la la, la la la. Dear Mr. President, come take a walk with me. Take a walk with me. Let's pretend we're just two people and you're not better than me. I'd like to ask you some questions if we can speak honestly. What do you feel when you see all the homeless on the street? Who do you pray for at night before you go to sleep? What do you feel when you look in the mirror? Are you proud? How do you sleep while the rest of us cry? How do you dream when a mother has no chance to say goodbye? How do you walk with your head held high? Can you even look me in the eye and tell me why? Na, 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 na. Dear Mr. President, were you a lonely boy? Were you a lonely boy? How can you say no child is left behind? We're not dumb and we're not blind. They're all sitting in your cells while you pave a road to hell. What kind of father would take his own daughter's rights away? And what kind of father might hate his own daughter if she were gay? I can only imagine what the First Lady has to say. You've come a long way from whiskey and cocaine. How do you sleep while the rest of us cry? How do you dream when a mother has no chance to say goodbye? How do you walk with your head held high? Can you even look me in the eye? Let me tell you about hard work. Minimum wage with a baby on the way. Let me tell you about hard work. Rebuilding your house after the bombs took them away. Let me tell you about hard work. Building a bed out of a cardboard box. Let me tell you about hard work. Hard work, hard work. You don't know nothing about hard work. Hard work, hard work. How do you sleep?
So, listening to that poignant piece of music, we draw to a close today of this episode of Women of Our Time with Dee Wild Kearney. Can I ask you to do a very special thing? It's our message in a bottle section. So, Dee, if you wouldn't mind, if you had to throw a bottle into the ocean with a message in it to the world, to womankind and indeed mankind, what would it be?
Right, okay, I think for for me, it would be, right now we are too worn down, we are kept too busy, we are kept too frightened to actually look at things as they really are. And I would say every man and woman should stand on their conscience, and when they see something that is wrong, however hard it is, however frightening it is, we have to stand up and be counted, because it's far too important right now to allow this decline of our society any further than it's going.
Take urgent action on climate change.